So what was life like, basically, in Tudor and Stuart times? All right. Shakespeare, as I say, he lived in the middle of that period. So what would his life have been like, and what would life have been like for people at that time? Okay. Serious sort of guy, William Shakespeare. Well, most of the time. And we've already been through some of the here, like bicycles. Okay. Would they have had bicycles? And we're tending to think no. Sorry, I'm down here because there should be some volume. Oh, just a minute. Integrated anything? No, that's not it. No. We may have some problems with sound as well. There are some sound effects on this, but they're not coming through. So, yeah, like I say, can you imagine that Shakespeare would have ever ridden a bicycle? The people who've expressed an opinion think, well, we don't think so. Typewriters, again, people are saying they don't think so. On the other hand, guns, people are saying yes. I think they had guns in those days. So you do know something about it, yeah? And compasses? You think yes? You think yes? You think yes at the back there? Yes, okay. What about the printing press? Would that have come in during this period? Would it be something that they had before this period? When? What do you think? Do you think by this time they already had it? You don't think they already had it? You think it came in sometime during this period? Yeah? Anybody else want to hazard a guess? Or okay, so we think that it might have come in. You think it might have come in during this period. So Shakespeare's books could have been printed? Not sure. Okay, he lived in this time. You're not sure if it came in a bit later after him, or okay. So all right, that's a little bit more difficult, right? It's getting a bit closer to sort of the exact period. So would they have had that? Maybe not quite as that looks more like Victorian probably, but did they have some kind of simple version of the printing press? Okay. Electric lighting, I think I know what you're going to say. No, they didn't have electric lighting. Okay. So Shakespeare could never turn on a light like we can now. Newspapers. Again, it's another more difficult one, isn't it? I don't necessarily mean like, that looks that sort of format, but something that was like that, something that told the news. Did they have that? Do you think they did? You think basically they didn't have that? Okay. All right then. Tobacco. Could the people in those days light their pipe or have a cigarette? You think so? Yeah. Yeah. What? Right from this time, or you think it came in somewhere during this period, or you think it's later? Later than 1485. You think it's later than 1485, okay, but you think that by 1714 definitely. They had it, yeah? Yeah. So somewhere in between. Yeah? Okay. What about tea? The English, they're very famous for their tea. Were they drinking? Would William Shakespeare take a break and say, "I'll stop writing my works of genius and I'll have a cup of tea"? Do you think he could? You think he could? Yeah, you think he could? Yeah, all right then. Clocks. Clocks, I mean, you know, that's a complicated mechanism, like a typewriter. But then if they had guns, okay, yeah, that's right, no bicycles. In fact, they didn't have bicycles until, as you say, after the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. And even then, they didn't have the idea of pedals. For 50 years, people went around with bicycles that they just sort of pushed along on their legs like that, kicking off from the ground, okay? No pedals. It wasn't until, yeah? How does that work? I think it probably worked quite well when you were going downhill. Okay. But not really very efficient, yeah? First bicycles with pedals didn't come in until, you know, the 1860s. All right. And the next one. Yes, again, the answer is no. No typewriters, as you correctly guessed. Typewriter is another 19th century invention, and that's even later than the bicycle. 1873 was the first commercially successful typewriter. There had been attempts before that, but they came up with something that looks a little bit like a modern typewriter in the 1870s. And Shakespeare not only wrote everything by hand, but he used a feather pen. I mean, even Charles Dickens and writers in the 19th century were doing that. They used feather pens to write with. I don't know if you've ever seen a feather pen. I've got one at home, an old...
I've seen one in Harry Potter.
At where?
Oh, the movie.
In a movie. It's okay. Right. Can you imagine writing with something like that? Okay. I don't know how they even managed to write words. Never mind a whole, you know, book. But they did. And yep, guns. Yes, they had guns. This is a 17th century cannon. Okay, and this is a set of 16th century pistols. So they had both, you know, a variety of different types of gun in those days. Sometimes it seems like it's not so much, is it more difficult to have a typewriter than a gun? It's like, what's more important? Shockingly, killing people is more important than writing books. So they had guns. They didn't have typewriters. And compasses, yes, and that's a very important part of this period. The fact that they had compasses is one of the things that makes it, it's kind of tokucho, a special quality of this age. Okay? What happened? Columbus discovered America, okay? Without the compass, he couldn't have done it, or he probably couldn't have done it. Actually, that's not true. The Vikings discovered America much before that, but it was a very risky, dangerous thing. He had some sense. He knew where he was in the middle of the sea, okay? He knew which direction to go, okay? Yeah? Scandinavia no 1000年前ぐらい no kaizoku mitai. They're Vikings. Okay, I don't. You probably have an image of a long ship like this, something like this, with a big thing in the front and a sail on it, and lots of people rowing. Do you have that kind of image? And they've all got helmets, and the helmets have got these things on them. Yeah, they're Vikings. They came from Scandinavia. They terrorized Europe 1,000 years ago. All right, and they were kind of Kaizoku society, very violent, very famous for their fighting, and they were very. In these little boats, they sailed across the sea. Hundreds of miles, sometimes thousands of miles. And one group went to America, long time before Columbus, but they didn't survive. They left after 20 years or something. They went back to Europe. So, okay, compasses, which made the age of exploration and discovery by sea, made that age possible. Ships travelled all around the world. Okay, Francis Drake was famous English sea captain. Went all the way around the world in his little boat. They're quite big, but for today they seem quite small ships. And the printing press actually came in Germany in 1455. Okay? So, yes, they had the printing press all through this period, all through the early modern period. Shakespeare, certainly, his books were published. It was more than 20 years later, after Gutenberg, that the printing press was introduced into Britain. All right? But even so, that's still before the beginning of our period, just before the beginning of the Tudor period. Okay? And electric lights, well, of course not. No. What did they use? They used oil, they used candle wax. Those would be the main forms of lighting in those days. And now this is a difficult one. The answer is basically no, because although the newspaper was first published in Germany, it was not introduced in England during Shakespeare's lifetime. So Shakespeare would not have read a newspaper. Okay, the newspaper actually came in, the first newspaper in English appeared about 4 years after Shakespeare died. Right? So it's interesting because they were beginning to have that kind of thing. This is an age where those kinds of things, newspapers and things, are beginning to develop. All right? And if we look at the 17th century, the later part, the second half of the century, they're really starting to have newspapers that are a bit more like, they're looking like this, and they're giving news about what's going on, and they're more like what we think of as newspapers today. Okay? So it's no for that one. This one, it's a kind of, yes, it's yes, because tobacco was brought in 1578, okay? So Shakespeare would have been 14 years old, and quite quickly tobacco became fashionable. And potatoes and other types of food were brought in from America at the same sort of time. Tea, of course, came from the other side of the world. Tea came from Asia. And it's just giddy possible that Shakespeare drank a cup of tea, but almost certainly not. All right? The first mention of tea was in 1615, and he died in 1616. So when tea first came into England, it was very expensive. It was only for the sort of elite. It only started to become popular later on, towards the end of the 17th century, when the Queen at that time made a kind of fashion that she brought from Portugal. She was Portuguese, and she and her husband, kind of people wanted to copy their custom of drinking tea. And that's in the later part of the 17th century. So this is when tea is starting to become a fashion. Actually, coffee houses became, they developed before tea houses. So coffee came first, really, in English society, even though it's famous for tea today. And even then, it would have been a fairly expensive drink. Okay? Actually, because the water was dirty, most people drank beer, even for breakfast. Okay? They're probably going around quite drunk all the time. So, okay, sorry, we have one more, don't we? Let's have this one. And yes, they did have clocks. All right. Again, it gives you a sense of what they thought was important. Knowing what the time was, being able to make an appointment with someone. This ancient clock is from the 14th century in the Church of Ottery St Mary's. Okay, it looks different from our clocks, and you think, how do you tell the time on that? Well, you can see it's got up to 12 here, do X11. It's upside down. Okay, so it's starting. Latin numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, you can see those going around there. It goes up to 12 here, and then it goes again up to 12. So 12 up to 12 midday and up to 12 at night. So you couldn't tell the minutes on it very easily. Yeah, but you could roughly tell the time reasonably well. And before that, they had they used the sun. The shadow from the sun would fall onto a round, and it would tell the time depending on the position of the sun. So they had quite a lot of ways of checking the time, using sand in an hourglass. All right, sand would take 1 hour to go through, and then when it finished, they turned it over again, so they would know. They'd know when their potatoes were cooked, or something like that. So yeah, time was obviously quite important to them. All right, now, because the purpose of the class is to help you to practice your English, I'm giving you just a short dictation. Okay? So you've got most of the words written there. See if you can fill in the rest of the words. All right? I'm just summing up the things that we have talked about today. So, during the period that we will be studying on this course, there were no bicycles, no typewriters, no electricity. People walked or used horses. They wrote with feather pens. They used oil and candle wax for lighting. Well, they had the compass for exploration and navigation. They had clocks to tell the time with, and they had guns. They had printed books, and newspapers appeared during this period. goods like, sorry, is it a bit quick? Goods like tobacco, potatoes, and tea were being introduced from America and Asia. Okay, I'll read that through again and you can see if it looks smooth on your page. During the period that we will be studying on this course, there were no bicycles, no typewriters, no electricity. People walked or used horses. They wrote with feather pens. They used oil and candle wax for lighting. But they had the compass for exploration and navigation. They had clocks to tell the time, and they had guns. They had printed books, and newspapers appeared during this period. Goods like tobacco, potatoes, and tea were being introduced from America and Asia. Okay? So we've got a general sort of picture, which I think is important because the first time I taught this course, some students thought that Shakespeare lived at the time of the Industrial Revolution. And that's history department students. Okay, so having a sense of history is, quite difficult, I think, I mean, can you imagine that when I was your age, there were no computers, no K-Tag, no mobile phones, and the world has changed, very quickly in my lifetime. Okay, some technologies have come in. Videotape. Have you even seen videotape? Maybe when you were small, yeah. Maybe you still have some old ones at home. All right, but it's come and it's gone. Woof. All right. These days, these things change so quickly. You blink and you miss it. Okay. Those days, life was slower, but still, it's difficult to catch all the details of what life was like at that time. All right. So I thought it was like maybe fun to have a simple start to the course with a little questionnaire like that. So the next part of the course is going to look, again, in a fairly simple way at the country itself, England. All right, just to get some of the basics before we start looking at the history and the more complicated stuff next week. Okay, so